All right, welcome back to the Transfigured Life. I am met here with Father Jonathan, Archpriest, 30 years, because on Christmas Day I said 25, 30 years, and we have a special guest with us. We have Rachel Wilson. She is a wife, Orthodox Christian mother of five,
Hmm.
and she is a homeschool advocate as well as an author of a book called Occult Feminism. Rachel, how are you doing?
That's the book
Oh,
right
she's got it
there.
with. Okay,
There it
okay,
is.
In case
that's
anyone
the
needs to
book.
screenshot it. Yes, this is the book.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here today.
I got one too now.
Yay!
Good stuff.
Nice how you just passed that right through the panel there too, man.
Yeah,
That was
That was
great.
really cool how that
there's a little
worked.
bit of magic, right, Father? But not dark magic.
Well, Rachel,
um,
welcome, and we are delighted to have you with us, and we want to kind of get right into it because there's so much that we can talk about. So
right.
maybe one of the first things we can ask you for our listeners to contemplate. We want to ask you about the origins of feminism. And a lot of our viewers, for example, might come across the terms first wave, second wave, and third wave feminism. And I know that has a lot to do with the history and development of feminism. So can you kind of walk us through all that and tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So, I actually just wrote a piece that I presented at a conference via video, similar to what we're doing here, live stream video for one of the premier seminaries in Moscow, an Orthodox
Mm,
seminary there, about the roots of feminism and how it comes out of paganism and occult practices. And what that means for us in the 21st century in the church, especially in a place like Russia, where the church there under Bolshevism was so persecuted and so run underground for so long, and 70 something years of communism, which, absolutely condemned the church. How it's tough for a lot of the churches there finding their way back because a lot of people are trying to find an identity. They're going back to things like paganism, like the old Russian pagan beliefs and things like that. So I
mm,
just wrote a piece for that, which you can find on my Substack if you guys are interested in like a really deep dive on that.
okay.
But the origins of feminism in my book, I start all the way back in ancient Sumer, where you had Ishtar and Inanna worship. You had like um, goddess worship, temple prostitution, things like that. It's like some of the oldest beliefs. Of course, we know that Christ has been here from the beginning and Christianity has been here from the beginning, and the Old Testament teaches the Trinity. And so we know that, but a lot of people may have this idea that Christianity is a new religion that started 2000 years ago and that prior to that it was something different. But a lot of the Old Testament is talking about these pagan groups that the Israelites were dealing with and what they believed in and what they worshiped, and it calls the gods of those nations demons. Well, if
Mm,
you take a look at ancient goddess worship, you can see all these elements of modern feminism there very strongly. It really hasn't changed at all. I think the reason for that is that it's the same spirits who were behind it then are the same spirits that are behind it now. Even though
right.
this is something of a new political thing, feminism, maybe a couple hundred years old, but prior to that, and even now, it's a spiritual element. And I think that's why we're seeing a resurgence of things like Wicca, witchcraft, paganism, in the even in countries that were dominated by Orthodoxy and other forms of Christianity until really recently. The reason for that is that feminism comes out of like a goddess worship mindset, that there's a divine feminine, that women's sexual power, women's power to both create and destroy is something that should be worshipped as like a god, like goddesses. So I cover in the book many of these goddesses over the years from all different parts of the world, from all different traditions, and how even the modern feminists of like the 20th and 21st century use those goddesses as like their icons. So Lilith, a lot of the like really radical feminists online love Lilith. They'll have her in their profile picture. There's something called witch talk. It's like a very popular hashtag with something like 1 billion views on it. Uh, Talking about how witchcraft is great because it's empowering. It you worship your divine feminine elements within you. So this is actually where it comes from. And the reason I wrote the book, the reason that I wrote this and who I was really writing it to, primarily is Christian women, Christians altogether, but especially modern Christian women, because in the West, in the modern times, I feel like a lot of women think they can be feminist and Christian at the same time and that those things are compatible. And I detail in the book how this comes out of like social gospel and egalitarianism and things like that, these big political movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how the Protestants, being kind of the radical revolutionaries in the religious world at the time, really adopted feminism. They adopted a lot of Enlightenment ideas, and how they pushed that to the forefront. So that's where feminism comes from. And really what I'm trying to get across is how it's not compatible with Christianity, which is a patriarchal religion, and that's not a bad thing. So we should talk a little bit about the history of why people believe that feminism. You wanted to know about the first, second, and third waves. And most people will say, well, first wave feminism was good because women were really oppressed, they were enslaved, life was horrible for them, that men could lead wave feminism to liberate women. Now, this is probably the most controversial part of this that I talk about, which is that first wave feminism was not only not good, it was perhaps the worst. It was perhaps the worst. It really opened Pandora's box. Yeah. There's a really fantastic PhD thesis, which is now a huge book you can buy on Amazon, by a Swedish professor. He is a Luciferian himself, but he wrote his whole PhD thesis on how the suffragettes and the like 1900s feminists, all the ones that we all know, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Joslyn Gage, Emmeline Pankhurst, these like giants of early feminism, they openly said that Lucifer was their liberator. They openly denied believing in the Gospels or the church. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 37 other feminists wrote something called the Woman's Bible. Most people have no idea about this. Most Americans do not know this existed. You can still buy it on Amazon right now as well. And in the forward, in the forward to the book, Stanton, who was supposed to be a Christian, she was supposed to be like an influential Christian at the time. Same with Susan B. Anthony. It was hard to find anybody in America who didn't identify as a Christian, but a lot of them were Unitarians, or they were other various types of like really radical Protestants. She and these other women rewrote the Bible from the perspective of the oppressed woman. And they took out any reference to patriarchy. They took out, and they wrote kind of like an apologetic with each chapter, explaining why they don't think that Eve was responsible for the fall, why they don't believe that the Mosaic Code was given to man by God. They think men made that up. They think most of the Bible was made up by men to oppress and control women. And so they go through the whole Bible and rewrite it and then give this apologetic for why it's wrong. And she says right in the foreword, I don't really believe that Christianity is a true religion. I believe in something of a more, I'm paraphrasing here, but she believed in more of a perennialist thing. And she talks about the Mahatmas and things like this. But this woman's Bible was so popular, was first published, I think, in 1895. It was so popular, it had 3 runs in the late 1800s, and it was really widely distributed, very popular, and super influential. So when we look at Protestantism now, and female bishops, female priests, female preachers, all this like feminism that's crept into American Protestantism, this book itself is really, really responsible for that. It's probably the number one factor in getting all of that really accepted. But these women said Lucifer was the good guy. He was the one offering women knowledge, trying to liberate them from the oppressive, bad God of the Old Testament. So we have some Gnostic stuff coming in here too. But this was always built in, and most of the early suffragists were spirit mediums, fortune tellers, tarot card readers. They claimed to be automatic writers. They said that spirits were coming to them and giving them these pro-suffrage messages. Now, there's 2 ways you could look at that. If you're somebody who's not Christian and you're not a believer, you would look at that and say, well, they were either crazy or they were con artists, right? Neither of those looks very good for feminism. But if you're Christian, you might look at that and say, well, those are demons. They're getting demonic messaging. If they're trying to contact spirits, if they're trying to have seances, there's an old saying in the feminist world that there was hardly a suffragette who did not sit around the seance table.
But that doesn't
Now,
look good for them either.
no, it doesn't. Not in normative Christian America. It certainly didn't. But by 1970, we see the Rockefeller family creating women's studies as a field of study, like the women's studies departments in universities, completely founded by the Rockefeller
They always
family.
find a way to get involved.
They're always, it's hard to not find a Rockefeller underneath all these kinds of things, if you just look a little bit. They created women's studies and gender studies as a field. It didn't exist until 1970. The Ford Foundation was also involved in this too, by the way. And what they did in creating those departments, they're the ones that hold all of the records. So if you try to look through the Margaret Sanger papers, for example, you're going to have to go through universities to get to this information. They're kind of gatekeepers of it. They have a lot of the historical record, a lot of the writings of feminists that aren't published, they hold. And what they've been able to do is kind of rewrite the history of feminism using something called standpoint theory, which says that evil white oppressive men think there's such a thing as subjective truth, a subjective timeline to history, an actual historical record of events we can look at. They don't believe that's true.
Rachel, I'm sorry, just to clarify,
yeah, go ahead.
subjective or objective truth?
They don't believe in objective truth. They're kind of, they're postmodern Marxists. They don't think there is such a thing. They think that in order to get a real view of history, you need to look at it from the lens of the person who was had the most levels of oppression. So maybe a lesbian woman of color would have, according to them, a more accurate view of history than would a white heterosexual Christian man. Sounds silly, but this became really popular in academia in the 70s and 80s. There was a big war fought within academics over this, and it became the accepted thing. It became the epistemology they used to look at women's history. So now the story in the narrative we have, which most every person believes, is that prior to 1920, when women got the vote, life for women was torture. Men just systematically as a group got together and thought, how can we control women? How can we subject them to our whims and our desires? How can we make them, practically pets or slaves or something like this, right? That women had no rights. They couldn't get jobs. They couldn't have their own money. There's all these things that people believe about women's history that are completely untrue. So I take a couple of chapters in the book to go over those things and show historical proof that that is not true, that it was not true, and that even more importantly, women were not the ones who wanted suffrage. We were not the ones who wanted liberation. Women didn't historically see themselves as oppressed. There were more women who were in anti-suffrage activist groups in the late 1800s and the early 1900s than there were women who were in pro-suffrage groups, and not by a little. It was by a lot. In fact, the best evidence we have, there was a couple of states that ran referendums on, letting women vote on whether they wanted that option to be on the ballot. Like, should we even have a vote for women's suffrage? Do you even, something to kind of survey if they wanted it or not? And Massachusetts held one of the larger ones, and only 4% of the women who came out to vote said that they even wanted a suffrage option on the ballot. The rest of them were against it. So strangely enough, the pro-suffrage groups led by Stanton and Anthony, they blocked women from being able to vote in any further referendums on women's suffrage. I'll say that one more time because it sounds so crazy. Women's suffrage was so unpopular with women at the time that the suffragettes blocked women from being able to vote on whether or not they wanted to have the vote.
Sounds like a fairy tale.
It does. People hear this and they think, oh, this lady's crazy. She's making things up. So I've had to take a lot of time and effort to cite my sources and make sure that people can see this is really, really solid historical information. I'm certainly not the only person who has found this, It's just that usually it's men saying it. That male professors have tried to make these points, throughout the decades in the past, and they just get dismissed as misogynists and nobody listens.
Right.
So I think what we need to do is be honest about what feminism is. And there's a very famous American witch named Zuzana Budapest. She was the first to come here from the Czech Republic in the 60s. She moved to San Francisco and she got arrested for doing fortune telling and divination and other witchcraft practices because it was still illegal in the United States at the time. And she successfully fought in court under the freedom of religion clauses to make witchcraft legal, which it now is. And it's a protected religious position to have. And she said feminism is just the political arm of an ancient goddess worship religion, which is what she follows. So, even according to, I actually have a weird little cult following of witches who think I'm great because they think I'm giving them proper credit for the women's lib
They're like,
movement.
what, they're emailing you that? Like,
Yeah, yeah, they'll send me messages and be like, "Okay, I don't agree with you. Obviously, I hate the patriarchy and I'm not Christian, but thank you for giving us credit because we never get the credit we deserve for the women's lib stuff." So the first wave was all of that. It was not better. It was completely pushed through, shoved through by really wealthy financiers, golden age industrialists who had just passed the income tax. They had just created the Federal Reserve System, and they had just created compulsory public education. So, why did they want feminism? Why would they, fund this? Why would they bail suffragettes out of jail? Why would they pay for, the meeting headquarters and the pamphlets and the newspapers? Why would they essentially pay most of the politicians to get suffrage passed when women didn't want it? What, like, you're thinking, why would they do this? Well, for a few reasons. If you just passed the first income tax, which they were having trouble getting people to even pay, it's a great idea to get women convinced that the home is oppressive and you're a slave if you're working for your family and your husband, but you're liberated if you're working for one of their corporations and paying the income tax on your wages there, right? It gives them a big flood of new cheap labor that they desperately needed at a time when, they're building factories all across the country. The railroads had just been built a couple decades earlier, and they need to expand the economy. They need this big pool of cheap labor, and they couldn't get enough immigrants back then. You didn't have just endless streams of immigrants coming across the border, so they wanted women in the workforce. Well, if the women are all working and the men are all working, where do you put the children all day? Send them to the compulsory public education system where the state can indoctrinate them and teach them and give them whatever worldview, values, and ideas that they want. That's brilliant. And then on top of that, you've got a debt-based economy now because we just, passed the Federal Reserve Act. And if both parents are working and it drives down the wages and inflation goes up, we need home loans. We need car loans. This little revolution of feminism completely changed the world in ways that people don't even realize and can't even fathom. It's probably the single biggest revolution of all time. I would even put it ahead of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution enabled it because that's the reason feminism never became the dominant thing prior to this. But it was industrialization that allowed women to think they don't need men, right? I can go out and make my own money now. I just turn on the switch and the lights come on. I get in my car and I turn the key and it drives me to work on roads that are built by men in a car that was designed and built by a man. So it just created the conditions that made it possible to really separate the family and separate women from their family and make them, beholden to corporations and government rather than their own husbands, fathers, and their church. I know that was a little, sorry. I tend to I can really
no,
get
no.
going.
That's
No,
we asked you for
that's
a
fine.
reason.
But we're how was all this affecting Christianity at the time?
Yeah.
Sure. So like we were just talking about, feminism really got rolling along with a lot of the stuff that came out of the Civil War, which was, ending slavery and a lot of talk about rights, equal rights for former slaves along with white men. And the women's movement kind of latched onto that, and they were like, well, us too, we want to be in this. And there were a lot of people who did not see them as the same thing and didn't want them lumped together, but for political reasons, they did get lumped together. And a lot of churches at the time. Now, remember that America was mostly settled by the most radical Protestants, the ones that even the other Protestants in Europe were trying to kill them and hang them and burn them because they so radically deviated from traditional church teaching. We're talking about like Quakers, Anabaptists, Puritans, Pentecostals, some of these kind of more really radical sects that even the mainline Anglicans or the mainline Lutherans would not accept, and were persecuting them in Europe. So they came here to make settlements. So we have these roots of this really radical Protestantism, a lot, and I go over them in the book. Many of them Unitarians, a lot of them Marxist adjacent. They had this way of wrapping Marxism and collectivism in with their Christianity, and then it turned into what we now kind of call the social gospel. And this is where we get this first depiction of Jesus as this hippie guy who just wants everyone to love their brother and not judge, and we're all the same, and like you can, there even then there was a lot of ecumenism wrapped in this. We're like, oh, you can be kind of Buddhist, or you can be a little bit New Age, you can be a spiritualist, or you can mix some of your Appalachian witchcraft in with your Christianity, and that's fine, as long as you're not the Catholic Church, because those are the bad guys. So we get this social gospel that thinks that Christianity is basically a spiritual vehicle for egalitarianism. And we still have a really strong vein of this today. And you'll see it all the time on social media. If you try to talk to anybody, if you try to say, hey, you know what? I don't think that the church should permit homosexual marriage, for example, you'll get instant pushback from evangelicals who will say, well, who are you to judge? And if a man and a woman, God loves them the same, you can't judge. Now, you and I know that judgment is different than having spiritual discernment. We're not seeing a person we disagree with and damning them, right? Necessarily. We're just saying this is not the church teaching. This is not what Christ and the apostles taught. This has never been accepted by the church. That's different than the judgment they're talking about, but people can't discern between those anymore. So feminism came out of this social gospel stuff where you had a lot of really radical Protestants arguing. Quakers, surprisingly, Quakers and Shakers were very, very feminist, probably the earliest ones. They experimented with having female deacons, priests, pastors. Back in the 1700s, they were already experimenting with this. They even experimented with some gender swapping. They had little breakaway communities where the men would watch the children and take on the mother's role, and the women would try to go and do farm work. It didn't work very well, didn't usually succeed, but they were trying these things, and they would mix in things like vegetarianism and Marxism and things we would consider more leftist. They would try to wrap this in. In fact, in the 1840s in America alone, there were dozens of breakaway utopian communities of these various religious sects. And they were usually communist, they were usually Marxist, socialist, and they were early gender abolitionists. They foresaw they thought that the whole point of Christianity was, as we become more Christ-like, we're all going to go back to this Edenic state where there was no gender, which again is not something that we don't believe gender is a result of the fall in the church. There were some church fathers who speculated that, and there were some heretics who speculated that. And these little cults would kind of pick, how they like to cherry pick something like that. They'd pick something like that and then run with it and make it like their primo doctrine of what they're going to do. So it was really these kind of radical little groups who had these radical egalitarian ideas, these new reimaginings of Christianity based on social gospel and based on the politics of the time. And they turned it into something completely different. But I mean, isn't that kind of what's going to happen if you tell everyone they're their own pope and they can just interpret the Bible how they want? They can just Me and my
So
Bible
simple.
alone in the corner,
Yeah.
and the Holy Spirit will tell me what it means. And so I detail several of these like with specific detail if anybody wants to know like a lot more about that and who some of the more prominent leaders of these kind of groups were. I do take some time to detail that in the book as well.
Yeah, yeah. So you brought up something very important, Rachel. Obviously, like it seems like feminism has had a huge effect on Christianity as well. I would say Protestantism played a huge role in this
Yeah.
country in what we see. Now let's talk a little bit about Orthodoxy. How, knowing what you know about the feminist movement, knowing what you've seen in Protestantism, how did you land into Orthodox Christianity? Where'd that go? Where'd you go there?
Well, it's the Lord does work in mysterious ways because it was completely they were separate things that happened at the same time. Very
Mhm.
bizarre. I was raised in a Dutch Calvinist community
Another
in like a
Calvinist.
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Yep.
snap.
My dad's family is Dutch, and we lived in a county that's almost all Dutch farm people who are very traditional, staunch Dutch Calvinists. I mean, like probably the more extreme types, like Dutch Reformed, Christian Reformed, Netherlands Reformed. If you know anything about those denominations, they're very trad, right? The women are very covered and we're very conservative, but it's like extreme Calvinism kind of.
Mm,
It was things like we were allowed to dangle our feet in the pool on Sunday, but we couldn't swim in the pool on Sunday. And if your neighbor mowed his lawn on a Sunday, you were like calling his mom to let her know your son is over here mowing his lawn on the Sabbath, that kind of thing. Very, very legalistic, very puritanical. And I always like my earliest memories are believing in God and praying from the time I was super, super little. But I always kind of knew that there was something off. Like I went through the catechism there in that church at 14, and I remember having lots of questions, and my pastor kind of being like,
again?
like annoyed with me that I'm like poking holes in the logic and
Yeah.
in the system and going, wait a minute, this contradicts. And he was just like, for Pete's sake, just pray about it, okay? And just he
Leave
kind
me
of just
alone.
hand waved it. He was like, "Ugh, just stop it," because everybody else there just wanted to get through it. But I was like, "I don't understand why you said this and it contradicts with that." I just early on thought there was something incongruent in the worldview, and then I watched my parents get divorced, and my dad really struggle with his faith because from a predeterminist view, he's thinking, well, if I'm failing at life and I'm depressed and I'm in despair and my marriage is failing, maybe I'm not, he's probably thinking maybe I'm not one of the elect. Maybe I'm irredeemable.
Right,
So he
right.
just kind of, that sent him on like a depression spiral. My mom rejected the church and became atheist, and she was like really into witchcraft and feminism and things like that. But my dad
Wow.
stayed, yeah, my dad stayed really conservative, and well, pretty conservative. He was struggling with his faith, but he was trying to hold on. So I grew up with like these two completely different worldviews too, and I'm trying to make sense of them. So we fast forward all the way to few years ago. I'm raising my own family. I'm going to church. I'm trying to find Bible churches. I had never heard of Orthodoxy. One thing you learn as a Protestant is that church history goes like this when you're raised Protestant. For me anyway. Catholic Church bad, then Martin Luther came, and that's when church history starts.
Right.
Church
It's
history
like
starts.
Catholic Church bad, and then they're just like, oh, the Greeks, like just, they kind
I
of
never even heard about them. I never even heard about them. It was like, who are they? We don't even know. All
right.
we know is the Catholic Church was bad, and then Martin Luther came and fixed everything, and now here we are. So 2020 happens, and the church I was going to, I thought it was somewhat solid, but I went to one of their evening things like on Sunday night where they were talking about it was for the theology nerd people, right? That really want to get into that sort of stuff. And I'm like, I want to go and learn about this. I want to know more about the actual deep theology. So I start going and they're talking about dispensationalism.
Mm.
And they explained dispensationalism to me. And I said, no, no, I don't think that's right. That doesn't, I again causing trouble, start asking questions and going, okay, well, if God gave us different dispensations of truth to different people in different times, and now we have to, they're very Zionist and everything, and I'm just going, no, I don't think that's right either. So I go home and I start reading and I'm trying to figure out, am I just wrong? Maybe I'm just wrong. They're the learned men of the church and they must know. And there must be something I'm not getting. So I'm going to read more. And I start reading the early church fathers for the first time. And, I think the first book I read was
Wait.
Against
So
Heresies.
hold on 1 second. So you knew there were early church fathers.
I didn't until I went home and I started trying to
Makes
just
sense.
Google search like dispensationalism and like where does it come from? And then, it's like a rabbit hole. You just keep working your way back. Like, okay, well, this seems new. Dispensationalism seems like it's a 1800s thing that was
Right.
kind of pushed with the Schofield Bible and some other stuff. So, okay, what happened before that? And what happened before that? And I'm like, what if I just go back to the beginning? Like what right after Christ, what were the apostles doing? Like I never even thought about that up until this point. Like
Whatever happened to the church the apostles left behind?
exactly.
That's actually our
So
first episode.
yeah, so I'm looking and I was talking to a friend who was into this stuff and he's like, check out, Against Heresies. That you might like that one. So I
Mm.
read that one by Saint Irenaeus first. And I'm like, well, so far the churches I've been raised in are doing many of these heresies. So
Wow,
if
wow.
and that's an early
Yeah,
work. Irenaeus is a
yeah,
very early work. So I was like,
150. Yeah.
I don't know, this seems like we might be on the wrong track, but I still didn't know what orthodoxy was. So then 2020 hits and all the churches locked down, including mine. And I message this same friend and I go, "What do I do now? Like what do I do? How am I supposed to worship?" And I remember specifically praying and asking God, "How do I properly worship when none of the churches are open? What do I do?" And I think it was like the next day, in my YouTube comes up like a debate between Jay Dyer and a Calvinist, I think it was. So,
Jay.
yeah,
Oh,
yep.
okay.
And so I'm doing my nails like girls like to do, listening in my earbuds to the podcast, and he's debating this Protestant, and point by point by point, he just completely refutes this guy and blows him out of
Literally.
the water. And my husband's like in the other room and he can hear me, and I sorry to swear, but I swore. I was like, S word. And then a few minutes later, I was like, damn it. Cause I'm just, my whole worldview is coming unraveled. And I'm like, and my husband goes, what's going on in there? Why are you in there saying damn it and stuff? And I said, because I think we're in the wrong church, and he's like, what? So I start explaining to him and he's like, hmm. And his family was evangelical, but very not didn't even really go to church a lot. They would talk about the Bible and they would read the Bible, but they didn't never even really go to church. And he's like, well, I've never thought about this either. Maybe I should look into it too. So we both start reading and it was kind of like the rest is history. It did not take long. Once I read through like some basics of orthodoxy, all the questions I had from the time I was 14, all the things that didn't make sense, all of the stuff, logically and rationally that didn't make sense. Boom, here's a coherent system that's been consistent and traditional for 2000 years.
Mm.
And to me, like, it makes sense of the purpose of Christianity. I used to have a terrible time evangelizing as a Calvinist. I don't know how some people do it. I
How do
couldn't
you-
do it
Right.
because people would say, right, so what if I'm not chosen? Or what if I don't, how do I know your
Right.
church is the
I've
right
come
one?
here,
Or
right. It's like I come here to
why
share
do
the
I want
gospel
to,
with you, but
and
it
why do
might
I
not be
want to
for you.
worship a God? Yeah, why do I want to worship a God that might have predetermined me to go to hell? He built a special place just to send most of us so that we could be tortured forever. That sounds terrible,
It's
right?
wild,
And
wild.
I did struggle with that stuff. So reading Orthodox theology, it's like, okay, this actually makes sense of the entire gospel. It makes the whole Bible. You don't have to make up this dispensationalism nonsense to try to force it to fit, to try to make it make sense. Um, and so it was like an answer to prayer for me. It didn't take much selling at all. It was like, this is what I've been looking for. This is what I've been looking for. And I asked my husband, because he said the same thing. He looked at me, and he's like, how did we not even know this church existed? How have we been Christians our whole lives and we don't even know that this is like the original, the actual church Christ founded with the apostles. How do we not know this?
Right.
And, I feel like there's almost a veil in the West. There's almost like it clouds our vision, you know what I mean? That most
Yeah.
people in the West don't even know. I mean, you have the Cold War and you have the schism, and those are meaningful reasons why most Westerners don't know about Orthodoxy. But I feel like it's almost a bit of a spiritual haze too, that blocks people from being able to see until they really start looking, until they're like, I really want to know what the truth is, even if it's hard. Because look, I think we all love to believe that all we have to do is say with our mouth that we believe Christ is Lord and we're saved, and we don't ever have to, that we get the stamp, we get the stamp and we go to heaven, and you're done. You're just done and you're all good and it doesn't matter what you do. Orthodoxy certainly demands a lot more of us, but at this point in my life, I just wanted what was true, not what was easy or expedient.
Well,
So,
Rachel, I think you discovered what so many people like you have discovered, especially over the last few years, is that you can't start reading church history and the fathers and stay Protestant.
yeah.
Right. Right. Right.
Not if you want to be honest with yourself, not if you
Right.
want to. I mean, I've seen people try to, like I said, they try to force it to work.
Yeah.
So they'll come up with, and this is why historically Protestants have had to come up with so many different doctrines and so many, well, let me explain, right? These kind of doctrines that they don't make sense on their face. And then later you find out they had to come up with something like to avoid splitting the Trinity, or to avoid denying the divinity of Christ, or something to explain. Like, I had never heard of the harrowing of Hades, even though it's right in the Bible.
Right
And
there.
me as a Protestant reading my Bible, I said to my husband, I know I've read this. How
Right.
did I not
It's
see it? You know what I
it's
mean?
not in the Protestant frontima, and it's just like
Yeah.
Right.
it's right there. It's crazy, like when you think about like how they celebrate, Easter, and we love our Protestant friends, but just respect to
Yeah,
what
yeah.
you just mentioned, like you have Good Friday, you get a nice Good Friday service, whatever. Nothing happens on Saturday, and it's like boom, we're here
Right.
on this. Like it's like this is a very essential part of the gospel, like.
Yeah.
But we could go on about that, but
Yeah, yeah, I could go on forever, but basically that's kind of how it happened. Was just, I know I had trouble evangelizing, and for me, if I have trouble understanding and articulating something, it bugs
mm,
me, and so I'm gonna
mm,
keep digging. And so that's what I did. And same thing kind of for my husband, where we're both kind of cerebral people. We like things to make sense, but
I can
more,
see that.
and my husband says, because he's been saying this lately, he's like, I started liking Orthodoxy because it seemed rational and sensible, and it seemed like something I could get on board with that didn't sound silly. But as he got in the church and as he started participating and practicing, that's when the heart moves. That's
Mm.
when
Yeah.
it becomes about something way, way bigger than that,
Because it's
that
Right.
not
is
it's not
hard
just
to
up here, it's
articulate.
a lot from here too. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. And well, I mean, things like the doctrine of the nous help you understand that. Whereas in Protestantism, you don't have something like that. You don't have an essence energies distinction that can make sense of what you're also feeling and experiencing. And that,
Right.
I think that's what was good about it for me, was like, okay, I understand why I'm here doing this. I understand what I am doing when I'm in church and why I'm doing it. And so when I have a spiritual experience of some kind, I'm not as worried that I'm in delusion, or that I'm being misled, or that it's in my imagination or things like that, because I have like understanding of the fullness of the faith that I didn't have before.
So
Mm.
Rachel, let's then bring this back to your very specific area of expertise. Um,
Yeah.
do you, how you mentioned earlier that Orthodoxy is very patriarchal, and you said, and that's good. And so it seems like we have a clash of worldviews between Orthodoxy on the one side and feminism, and it sounds like they're incompatible.
Yes. Yeah, so the word patriarchy has been completely bastardized. It really just means rule by the father. Now, if you are Christian, especially if you're a Trinitarian Christian, you would say we have God the Father, God the Son, and we have the Holy Spirit. None of those three persons are referred to as female, even though there are some sects who have tried to cram in some, some kind of Sophia element, or Protestants will accuse us of worshiping Mary, which we do not. We venerate her. She's incredibly important. She's the Queen of Heaven. She is the Theotokos, but she's not God, right? She's not herself a divine person.
Right.
So, and we have patriarchs, we have bishops. We've historically never had female leadership in the church. And then we've got scripture. Protestants, I'm so sorry, but the scriptures are really, really clear on this, that women are not to be priests, pastors, or anything like that. And people see this or hear this and they think it's oppression. Why, like women have to be able to do everything men can do. No, it's the wrong way of thinking about it. And I understand where it comes from, because we're Americans, or even in Europe, we're very egalitarian now, right? Ever since the revolutionary period, we think all people are created equal, and that means we're all the same and we're interchangeable. And, women can do everything men can do, only better, or something like this. And true Christianity says there's a good and proper God-given role for women and a good and proper God-given role for men. And it's about way more than just splitting up the house chores, right? It's not, people think that it's just about doing the dishes versus mowing the lawn, or working outside the home versus not. And it's about so much more than that. It's an anthropological question that we answer this, starting with the Trinity, and then going to our Christology, and then going to our anthropology, to understand how God made people and what he made them for. And he didn't make women to be men's slaves, but he did make us to be subject to man. And he made man the head of the home, and he made man the head of the church, and he made woman for the glory of man. This has been completely misunderstood to mean that, Christian men want women to be enslaved, that they don't want them to have their own brains, that they don't want them to, they want them to be under the thumb of the patriarchal Christian man. And it's not about that. I've done several shows with my friend David Patrick Harry. He's got a really popular YouTube channel called Church of the Eternal Logos, where we together have really dug into this a lot. So if people want like a really in-depth answer to the question that we're talking about, any of those videos are great to watch. But it's women, if you let me walk it back just a little bit. The doctrine of recapitulation says that Mary is the new Eve. She's the new Ark of the Covenant. She had the Lord in her womb. She had incredible grace throughout her entire life that made her really unique and special, and not susceptible to sin in the way that the rest of us are. And the Bible even says, paraphrasing again, that she, through motherhood and her virgin birth of Christ, is how the world is saved. This is how we should think of the role of women, right? Not that our sexuality is going to save us, not that, using our sexuality to manipulate and control men is Christian in any way, because it's not. So, I mean, it's just thinking about what a woman is and who women are versus who men are and what they're for. It's been the lines have all been blurred, and everyone has heard so much propaganda that everything is just, oppression of women and enslavement and control of women. And so they encourage rebellion, which is exactly what happened in the garden. So from the Christian perspective, no, we don't think that women are the same as men and should be fighting on battlefields with them, or should be, they don't have apostolic succession and things like this. And this is controversial stuff to say these days, because all of the other, even
it's not fair. It's not fair.
Yeah, it's not fair. No, but go ahead.
No, I was just going to say what you're saying is very similar to what my priest father Philip told me. He said something similar to the effect of like the woman's, like a lot of times people ask this question, why can't we do what the men are doing? It's not fair. They get to be the pastors, this, that, and the third. It's like, just like you said, we have to think about it a certain way. Like my priest would say, women have their own priesthood too, that men have no dealings with, this idea of giving birth, and it's like, so us kind of framing things properly, we don't have to see it as a men versus woman thing. And
No.
there's something that you said once, and I just want to quote you on this. You said, Feminism has sold us this lie that it should be men versus women, and that we should be in competition with each other instead of collaboration. So,
Yeah.
yeah, can you speak on that?
Yeah, exactly. That's now I also want to take a moment to differentiate between what I'm trying to say and what a lot of Catholics will say this, a lot of the more traditional kind of Protestants will say this. They'll say kind of equal but different. And yes, we do think that men and women are equal but different in the way that we are image bearers of God, that we are human beings. As far as our salvation and all those things, we are equal in the eyes of the Lord. But that does not mean that in any way women should have authority over men. And I know that's incredibly unpopular to say, but just because we are to submit to the authority of men does not in any way indicate we should be abused, neglected, treated badly. And that's not historically what Christianity did. In fact, Christianity really elevated the position of women
Mhm.
because other religions and pagan religions don't really do that. They were doing things like, having full moon orgies and temple prostitution. So if you think that's women's empowerment, I guess, but me personally, that I don't find that to be empowering. And Christianity created this, like the Phronema says, that men are supposed to be the protectors. They're supposed to be like
Mhm.
the castle walls that keep the women and the children safe. And what we forget in modern times in this industrial era we live in is that men, yes, they have the authority, but with the authority they have incredible amounts of responsibility. They have incredible responsibility. So for men to have to be the priesthood, you could see that as a privilege, but it's also comes with incredible responsibility and hardship. And I think my one of my daughters asked our youth minister about why women couldn't be priests, and he said, well, he gave the biblical answer and the traditional answer, and he said, you shouldn't think of it as we're keeping you from something that you want to do. You should think of it as this is a life that's really hard, and we don't necessarily want to put all of that on you. You've got the responsibility of being mothers and raising, generations of children. We're not going to throw the priesthood at you too, because it's really too much for one person. It's
Right.
too much to ask of one person. So I think that just in the modern times we've gotten so confused over thinking that if somebody says, hey, this thing is not for this group, that this is oppression. That's just such a dominant narrative, and I'm constantly trying to fight my way through that. So the patriarchy is protective. Christian patriarchy is protective, and it's ruled by the Father, but it's by a benevolent Father. God the Father so loved the world that he gave his only Son that we
Mm.
might be saved. That is not oppression. That is not a tyrannical father that wants
Mm.
to oppress women. And the men of Christianity are supposed to be icons of Christ and act like him. And so what do? They protect, they provide. Um, and that's their role. But for women, what's hard for women when I try to talk to them about Christian womanhood from my perspective is that yes, you're going to sacrifice. You're
Yeah.
going to sacrifice a lot of your what you want for yourself. It's not going to be all about you. And that's the world that we live in now teaches this. The world we live in now tells women you are perfect the way you are. There's no need to repent. You don't do anything wrong. You don't make a mistake. You're beautiful. You're amazing. You go, girl. It's just this like women can do no
Right.
wrong. And if they do, it's the fault of a man somewhere who made them that way, right?
Mm.
So in my view, when I look at feminism, I think the most demonic thing about it is that it convinces women there's no need for humility, there's no need for repentance. How are we to come to Christ if we believe in feminism, which tells us that? How
Mm.
exactly do you repent if you're told that you're perfect how you are? And that you don't need, not only do you not need a man, but I guess you don't need God either because you're perfect. You're already a goddess. You're already a queen, right? So
Goddess, yeah.
Women is
So
mhm.
Rachel, let me ask you this question. let's take what your daughter asked the youth minister about why
Yeah.
women can't be priests, because a lot of people are asking that question today about women being deacons.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it's causing, I don't think the issue necessarily is it has any traction, but you've got, in the opinion of some, a small number of people making a lot of noise about this.
Yes.
Your take on that?
Oh boy. Well, I've talked about this. I did an episode with Jay where we talked about institutional capture, where we talked about how these big NGOs, these globalist entities, these various non-governmental organizations that have their own agenda, they pump money into churches and corrupt the churches and get them on board with a certain agenda, which usually includes radical ecumenism, like a one world religion. The interfaith center in Dubai is a great example of this, where the Abrahamic faiths, as though Muslims, Christians, and Jews can all come together and worship together, because they kind of basically almost worship the same God, except we completely don't. And so this is kind of what they've done with the feminism stuff, because I get this pushback a lot when I tell people that we have to bring back marriage as a sacrament of the church. People talk all day long about the divorce rate, about how bad the dating scene is, about how families don't stay together, the number of kids being raised in broken homes. And if we say, look, you should return to marriage through the church to try to remedy that, they say, well, but the churches are just as bad. And the thing is, they're right. They're right. The Protestant churches, and even most of the Roman Catholic churches, my friends Tim and Stephanie Gordon, we've talked about this a lot, about how Vatican II really just stuffed feminism into the Roman Catholic Church.
Mm.
And then the same thing happened earlier in the period we were talking about with the suffragists and the Protestant churches, where these big money NGOs get in there. And what I think has happened is that they have convinced everybody of this social gospel, and that unless women are in the priesthood, unless women can be deacons and do everything men can do in the church, that the church is denying women the opportunity to serve, that the church is denying them the chance to serve the church, or really live their faith. Well, if we look at all the female saints we've had in the history of the church, none of them demanded that they had to be priests in order to serve the church. None of them said, you must make me a deaconess or I cannot, fulfill my spiritual life. They became saints without any of that. So
Mm.
I think the reason that some people are pushing this is political. I think some people it's personal. I can't tell you like what's in their hearts, but they tend to come out of places like Fordham University, which have long been compromised by NGO money. There's a piece on my Substack that goes over this, how the Luce Foundation funded Fordham and these women's studies, deaconess groups. And I don't want to say anybody's name, but there's certain people who are really pushing for feminism inside the church, for women deacons, women altar girls, you know, at all aspects, really all levels. And so they'll say they're not. They'll tell you, no, 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 we just want a revival of this old, very like limited deaconess thing that happened in the early church, and they kind of distort the history. They don't really tell you why there were exceptions made in some cases and in some places, and they'll say we just want women to be able to serve. And I sat in on one of their Zoom meetings because I thought, I don't want to misrepresent and I don't want to make assumptions. I want to hear what it is that they actually are arguing for, what they're really thinking. And it was far worse than I thought it would be. It was
Wow.
so much worse than I thought it would be. I sat through this whole like hour and a half presentation, and these are lovely women. Don't get me wrong. I think they've been lied to, and and that they believe what they're saying, but they don't have the full history and the full picture. I think they've been taught incorrect things. But what they were saying is, yes, we want women altar servers and chanters, and we want female deaconesses, because they even had one who was a neurosurgeon say, you are damaging women's brains if they want to be priests. And you tell them no, it traumatizes them, and the trauma is actually damaging their brain. This was an actual presentation and an argument that was given. So at the end, when they
What did
opened it
you
up to,
what did you say? Like,
well, they opened it up to Q&A at the end, and I was just, typing. I'm like, what about this? And they read one question, then they began to read my question, and one of the ladies said, "You know what? We've gone much too long. We're so sorry, but we have to end the stream, and we'll do another one soon." And they ended the stream because I was asking questions and saying, this source that I have says that female deaconesses were not the same as an ordained deacon like we would have today. It was a different thing. It wasn't an ordained minister. It was something where in the early church, if you did not have men who could do it, or the customs, say for baptism, if a woman had to be naked or something like that, they would have somebody who could do some of those things, but she was not ordained as a priest. You guys seem to be misrepresenting that and saying it was something other than that, and that we have this historic tradition of ordained female deacons in the church, when that's really not true. And I feel like you're really stretching it. So I think a lot of it is because the propaganda for feminism is so thick that everybody is swimming in feminist water like fish that don't even know they're in water. It's
right.
the air that you breathe. It's we're all taught from the time we're tiny, from the time we're little infants, and watching like the little cartoons. The little cartoons that 2 and 3-year-olds watch are very like female empowerment. Girls can do anything boys can do. The little girl's gonna win the race. The little girl's gonna, save the day. This idea that
Well,
anything
except when
other
it comes
than
to
goddess
sports.
worship is oppression. Huh?
I said, except when it comes to men trying to get into women's sports, right?
Yeah, some of them have problems with that, but I mean, it's more than that. If we're going to be
Right, right.
honest, it's more than that. I do
Mhm.
not see women fighting for equality in dangerous, dirty jobs where you can die. I don't see them demanding to be trash collectors
Right.
or sewage cleaners or power linemen, or the guys that are on those really dangerous Alaskan fishing boats. They're not trying to work on oil rigs. They want jobs that offer power and money. That's what they want.
Right.
Feminists who are demanding equality, they want power and money. They're not demanding equality on the front lines of battle. The Navy SEALs have been open to women for like 15 years now, and not a single one has been able to pass. It could be that I'm not a bitter misogynist, and that I just understand that there are biological and spiritual and ontological differences
Differences.
between men and women, right? But to
Yeah,
say something like that in this modern age is, I mean, they really think I'm the heretic, if anything, quite often if I'm talking about this. So
So, Rachel, one last thing, perhaps. Luther might have something to ask too, but I wanted to ask you this. What do you see in today's church as an invasion of, or a danger of, or a bad influence of feminism in the Orthodox Church today?
I think, well, the female deaconess fight is definitely one of them. Basically, people who think the church needs to, anyone who's telling you, look, the church is old fashioned and it's misogynistic and it's bigoted and it needs to get with the times and it needs to come into something where it can identify with the current culture. That's exactly what destroyed both Roman Catholicism and Protestantism to begin with. That's why you see people flocking from both of those traditions to Orthodoxy, because Orthodoxy has been the one church that has done what Christ said it would do. And it has not changed with the times. It has not bent to the culture. It has not capitulated to the forces of the world that want it to change. We're supposed to be in the world and not of it. We're not supposed to. What good is the church if it conforms to a wicked culture? That
Mm,
we just spent the last hour demonstrating how the current culture and the current thinking is Luciferian, and the very people who created these ideologies and pushed them said, yeah, these are Luciferian ideas. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, right? These are, and these people want us to conform to that. That's not what Christ said his church was here for, and that's not what he said. He said the gates of hell would not prevail against it. So that's one thing to look for. Another thing, anytime they're trying to push a lot of this modernity stuff, but I think there's subtle things we should watch for. Like in Protestant traditions, women's Bible study groups are very popular. And these women's devotional books, these women's Bibles are very popular. Girls like to have a Bible that's got pretty flowers on it or something. It's sparkly. And they like to get together. And personally, I think it's a mistake to have a women's Bible group that has no pastoral care over it. Do you know what I mean? I think it can be very dangerous to have a group of women just sitting with a Bible and they start letting their imaginations run wild, or they start reading their own eisegesis into text and creating. That's a very Protestant thing to do. I'm not saying I'm against Orthodox women's group. I think those are fine, but I think we do need to be careful. The women in those groups should be subject to men who are priests, pastors, clergy, kind of overseeing and guiding. It should be older women who are trusted, like maybe your Matushka is probably a pretty solid lady who could, you know, do a woman's retreat with some of the women from the church, and that's fine. I think any time that you go to like a monastery as a ladies group is probably great. So I think there's ways we can do it, but I think we need to be careful not to fall into the Protestant trap of having like little women's circles that start creating their own theology almost. I think that would be something to look out for. And I would love to see the Orthodox Church separate itself by really encouraging women to be mothers, to be wives, to be helpmeets, to be truly like Sarah called Abraham Lord, right? We're not supposed to come from this tradition where if our like I've gotten incredible amounts of pushback online for saying I bring my husband his food. I do all the cooking, I do all the cleaning, I bring him his food. I bring him a drink if he wants a beverage or something. If we're out in public and there's like a buffet, I will put together his plate and bring it to him. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm not saying you have to be me, but I am saying we shouldn't look at women doing that and go,
Why are
well,
you
what's
doing?
wrong with him? Why can't he get up and get it himself? I don't understand. What are his legs broken? This attitude, I think for Christian women, we need to reject this attitude. If we are Christian women, we are supposed to embrace serving the men in our lives, our children, our families, and our parishes. This should be something that sets us apart. This should be something that we shouldn't be dedicating our lives to corporations. Women are needed in the parish, women are needed in the home and in the nursery. They're needed at the sick beds of those who are ill. We historically are the ones that kept society and family together. We were the glue that did that good work. And now for some reason women believe that's only worth doing if like so they'll be a nurse, they'll go work in a hospital as a nurse if they're getting a paycheck and paying income tax. But then when they come home, if their husband is sick, they're like, I don't need to take care of you, so it's I would just love to see us set ourselves apart and differentiate ourselves that way by embracing a really godly womanly role and the attitude that goes with it, because that's what will save us. I feel like as women we're so tempted to use our sexuality, to use manipulation, emotional manipulation, to get things that we want. And I think Christ did not intend that. I think one of the reasons that we're supposed to be submissive is to save us from that. Because youthful beauty and attractiveness, I've just seen it destroy so many women. It just convinces them that they have these otherworldly powers and they can use that to manipulate. And by rejecting that attitude and saying, no, I want to serve those that I love. I want to serve people in my community, even serve my enemies, maybe, maybe I'm going to, go into some kind of role where I'm serving people who don't agree with me and don't like me, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think women embracing that's not slavery. It's not oppression. You are doing the Lord's work, and those things should be venerated. I would love to see real womanhood and motherhood venerated in our churches. And I think a lot of women will actually be drawn to that. I don't think all of us, the reason I say this is I get so many emails, DMs, even letters in the mail from women who don't want to be boss babes. They don't want to be sexy Instagram models, and they don't want to be CEO boss babes. They really just want to find a really nice man and have
Right.
babies and have a beautiful family life and not all this career pressure and everything. And they'll write me and they'll say, you know, I always wanted this, but my parents thought I had to go to college. You know, they wanted me to take on 60 grand in debt so that I could become a dentist or something. And they just don't
Absolutely.
understand. They think that I'm setting myself up for failure in life if I stay home with my kids and raise my kids myself. And if I stay married and I'm a submissive wife, they think that that's me not being a strong, independent woman. And I didn't know how to explain it to them until, you know, I read your book or I saw the video you did or something. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
just trying to give them a way to articulate and explain that no, this is not just a valid choice. This is a really good and godly choice. This is a salvific choice to
Right.
make.
And Rachel, that sounds pretty awesome. Like being able to like nurture your kids at home instead of like being away from them, and then having somebody, a complete stranger, like raise your kids. Like like
Yeah.
I there's so much beauty in what we have, what we have in the nice gender roles of, man and women and all that. But I do want to ask you two things. I know time's approaching us. So you've been in this sphere of being, you're knocking out, telling the truth. I know you've gotten a lot of heat in the process, right? And
Yeah.
that comes with the territory. And anybody that's about telling the truth knows that. What would you say are some of the top misconceptions in regards to feminism that you've heard, or arguments maybe you've heard, like, oh well, you want us to be in an abusive situation, or I don't know, you don't want us to vote, or like what are some of the top things you heard, and how would you respond to those?
Yeah, I think one of the top ones is, oh, so you just want women to be trapped in abusive marriages?
Right.
Well, first of all, we're not Roman Catholics and we're also not Protestants. From the Orthodox perspective, there's always been certain circumstances where the church has permitted a divorce. Now, we certainly don't encourage it, and this is why you need a spiritual father. This is why you need to be involved in your parish life, because you're going to have a priest who knows really what's going on with you and your husband and can help you instead of going to marriage counselors, these secular, psychiatric counselors. You have your priest who knows you and knows your dynamic and knows, so much about you and your husband and can kind of
Right.
help with that. But let's say there was a situation like abuse, abandonment, addiction, madness, insanity. These are things that historically, if the priest said, look, okay, this situation is now more damaging to the salvation of these two people than it is helpful, they may grant a divorce in that instance. So no, we don't have a history of trapping women in abusive situations that are detrimental to them. Now, if it was just two people who are extremely quarrelsome, I forget where I was reading this, but I think they used to say something like they would grant the couple the divorce if each of them would promise to go into monastic life after that. So it's like you can either stop arguing or you can both go to a monastery. How about that?
Learn to
So
fight your passions, right?
right, exactly. So we are very pro marriage and we are very anti divorce, but we're not we don't have this rigidity in this legal structure where we say never. So that's one thing to get out of the way, is like, no, rejecting feminism does not mean women are trapped in abusive situations or that they're allowed to be treated horribly or abused. The problem we have is that nowadays women think a man saying no to them is abuse. So, and I've had my husband ask this before in a debate where this girl was saying, well, what about emotional abuse? And he said, let me ask you. So if a woman is she's spending through the family budget at a rate that is, impacting their ability to pay the bills, impacting their ability to, be financially stable. And the husband says, look, I'm taking your credit card because you're just spending too much. Do you think that's emotional abuse? And she said, yes. So, I mean, in today's world, women think any sort of boundary at all is abuse, and so I want to get that out of the way too. Your husband lovingly having to tell you no sometimes is going to happen. And I will tell you, as a wife who is submissive to my husband, are there times he says something and I go, and I grumble a little bit? Yes. But as you go along in your marriage, that gets less and less, and you get better at, both of you will get better at working those things out. And my husband is so good to me that it's like the few times he ever says something I don't like, usually it's just I'm being grumpy or I'm being stubborn, and maybe the next day I'll be like, oh, that was really actually super reasonable and I was kind of in the wrong there. So there's that. Other objections. What if women don't have their own money? The man is going to know that she can't leave and therefore he'll abuse. Okay. It's putting, like, as though the only way to have a healthy marriage is if that man knows you could leave any second, right? That's what they think. And this is just a result of propaganda. They've seen it in a billion movies. They've seen it in a ton of TV shows. They've heard it repeated because feminists are very good at messaging. They're very good at propaganda. Um, so this idea that you have to be on the verge of leaving in order to get a husband to act right is also silly. Now, to see how silly it is, just flip it around. Do you think that it would be the same for men? Like, would it be healthy if your man was always, every day he's reminding I don't have to be here. I do have my own money. And if you say anything that I don't like, I can just walk out the door. That no woman would want that. Of course not. So again, this is like having the mindset that it's this mindset, the most dangerous person is your husband. And I wrote a whole piece about this as well. I wrote a piece where I went over the last 45 years of data from the National Incidence Study, which is a huge nationwide data gathering service that the federal government does, where any emergency rooms, battered women's shelters, child abuse, child protective services, any of those kind of agencies that might deal with abused women and children, they gather all the data from them and they compile it, and then they parse it out in different ways to see what kind of public policy is helping or hurting these situations, what the problems are. And when you look at the last 45 years of data, it shows that the safest situation for women and children, far and away, not even close, is when the mother is married to the father of the biological children and they live together. Every other situation puts both the woman and the children at higher risk. So stepdads, boyfriends living in the house, people cohabitating, subsequent marriages, any of these things. So women thought that if they didn't get married, they'd be less likely to be abused, but we find much higher rates of abuse among cohabitating couples, not among married couples, and it's lowest among married Christian couples. So this idea that's been planted in the public consciousness by movies that Christian men who marry you, they're just marrying you so they can control you and they just want to, that it gives them some sort of license to abuse, that's wrong. And the data doesn't show it. So like, if they were right, you would think we'd be able to see some kind of proof of this. And again, if you guys go to my Substack, rwilson.substack.com, that piece is like a couple down, and it goes over all of this data in depth. It's a big, long, nerdy piece because I wanted to put this myth to rest. And when I went over the data, it was even more on our side than I even thought it would be. It was just like super duper clear that if abuse is your concern, the best thing you can do is get married and be in the church with your husband. It's your best protection. It's not the thing that's going to enable it.
Rachel, any of these links that you've mentioned, if you'd like to give them to us, we'll post them in the comments.
Sure.
And we'll pin that at the top of the episode when that comes. I did want to reflect. I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I did want to reflect that a lot of people listening might be saying, "Okay, that's great, but women submitting to their husband and all that." But doesn't that assume that the husband knows and understands how to be the leader in the marriage? That's a topic for a whole nother episode, I think. But I will say that I think in our day and age, that is a challenge for most men is they've
Yeah.
not been taught and they don't know how to do it. And um,
Yes.
for this to really work, if a woman is going to uphold her side by saying, yes, I'm going to submit and do all this stuff, the man has to uphold his side, but he has to know what that means. And
Right.
I'm very happy to see the creation of things like the St. Paisios Brotherhood and other organizations that are trying to promote men's ministry. We're just starting one in our parish right now, and we're very excited about it. Um,
Yeah.
but this is something that's worth. We don't have time now, of course, but this is something that's definitely worth a much
Mm.
broader discussion that would integrate into this one right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it's so good to see channels like yours, like Father Josiah Trenum, like Church of the Eternal Logos with David Patrick Harry, who are men that are, very godly, good examples, but they're also masculine. I love seeing that these men understand that what it means to be a godly man, but also to be a masculine man, because we need that. It's so desperately lacking in this culture. When we make everything so feminized, it does become very indulgent and becomes very Luciferian. It becomes very like there's no boundaries, there's no structure, everything is permitted, and it's just very indulgent. And I think it's so unhealthy. And so I love seeing some masculinity coming back really through the church. And it's not toxic masculinity, it's this good, healthy, God created type of masculinity. The Bible is filled with really masculine, wonderful men who did great things and were great men of the Lord. So this idea that you have to be soft and weak or something to be good is just wrong also.
Right.
By the way, have you heard of Leon Pottles and his book, The Feminization of Christianity? The Church
No, I
Omnipotent
will
is,
write it down.
yeah, Leon Pottles, Poddles, and he wrote a book about over 20 years ago, but to me it was groundbreaking, called The Church Impotent: The Feminization of Christianity. I think you'd enjoy it. And by the
Mm.
way,
Yeah,
in that he
sounds like it.
talks about kind of what you do with the historical development of the feminization of Christianity, but he says twice in the book, he says, but there's one exception to this, and he says that's the Orthodox Church.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
which is a
true.
very masculine place for men to be. It's very,
Mm.
very interesting, though, the way he brings that in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Ra-
Sounds good. I'll check that out.
Rachel says something that's so key that I just feel like you just got to replay that again and not miss it. For whoever hears this episode, you just got to replay that part. You talk about how men is not the ultimate enemy of the woman, and on both sides, like women is not our greatest
Right.
enemy, either. Like, and I like this idea that we're supposed to be together and united. It's an illusion to think that like we are against each other. You know what I mean? Like, and the scriptures even tell us we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, but we wrestle against spiritual wickedness and principalities in high places. So I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's the demonic lie. As you talk about, occult feminism, like this is demonic. This idea that
It is.
like that
Yeah,
lie
I
that
mean,
talk about.
one thing I want to add really quick is
Yeah.
I read Genesis, Creation, and Early Man by Father Seraphim Rose, where he gives the Orthodox interpretation of the book of Genesis. And this was another like absolutely mind-blowing thing for me as I'm finding Orthodoxy. The Orthodox account of Genesis, just it's so incredible, and it's so like I feel like you could spend a lifetime just studying Genesis as an
Yeah.
Orthodox Christian. But he
Mm,
points out how when God saw what Adam and Eve had done, eating the fruit, when he went to Adam and said, "What have you done?" He said, "It was her. It was that woman you gave me. She is the one who made me do it." She blamed it on the serpent. He blamed it on her. So right from the beginning, the whole point of what the serpent was trying to do is pit the man and the woman against each other. He went through the woman to get to the man,
mm,
and then by the man wanting to indulge the woman, he committed this incredible thing and this incredible act that he didn't know was going to plunge all of creation into a fallen state and introduce death into the world just because he submitted to her on this one thing and didn't didn't do what God had commanded him to do. And then he tried to kind of blame it on her. So I think from the beginning, that's the reason the serpent went through the woman, was to pit the woman and the man against each other and convince them that they should be at odds. Because I think if we're not at odds, well, that's the point of Orthodox marriage. I've been to a couple Orthodox weddings now, and I love them, and I love that they don't do vows and that we read scripture and things, because it says exactly what the marriage is for and exactly how it's supposed to operate, and that these two people are responsible for helping in each other's salvation. You are to be working together toward the kingdom of God, and in doing that, you're going to save your children and everyone
And
around you.
that's what the crowns are for. They're not
Yeah.
crowns to make him the king and her the queen. Jesus and Mary are already the king and queen of the household. It's the crowns of martyrdom, that you're going to die to yourself to serve that person.
Wow.
Yes. Yes. And that is what I mean when I say we should have marriage as a sacrament in the church, because we shouldn't be surprised that marriage as a flimsy secular legal arrangement isn't working. I've had gym contracts and cell phone contracts that are harder to get out of than a legal marriage in the United States. It costs on average $700 and takes 3 months and you're out of it, right? No, this is something much more important than that. And I think that's why people rush into it with the wrong person too, because it's just basically a living arrangement. It's just a living agreement. It's like a rental contract. Whereas Orthodox marriage, you should be more careful in who you choose. But also, when those struggles come in the marriage, you will remember that those struggles are there for your salvation, and that what you're supposed to be doing is getting rid of your own desires and passions on behalf of the other person. And that's really hard. I know that people are watching this and thinking that doesn't sound like fun. Sometimes it's not, but the thing about it is that as you go along, you develop a connection with your spouse that it's hard to articulate. I can't explain it to you what it feels like. And my husband always says this. He's like, she's like the other half of me. People will complain. They'll be like, I just can't even get daylight between the two of you. And it's because at this point, we're just so in sync and we're so on the same page. And I care more about his success in life than I care about me. And same from him, right? He worked 60, 70 hours a week for 12 years so that he didn't have to see me bringing our kids to daycare and crying every day when I had to drop them off. He didn't care what he had to do. He wanted me to be able to be the mother I wanted to be. And he was like, if I got to kill myself to do it, I will. So that's what marriage is. That's what's meaningful, and that's what it should be. It should not be this flimsy legal contract that doesn't keep anyone together.
Yeah.
Amen. How many
That's well
children do you
said.
have?
Beautiful.
5.
5.
Very beautiful, very beautiful. Well, Rachel, thank you. We could go on with you. You're very just knowledgeable and almost like a hero in a sense. I have a lot of respect for you, and your husband is definitely very blessed. Thank you for blessing us with your presence. Father, any parting thoughts?
I think there's a lot here for people to think about. I kind of would even encourage people to go back and listen to this again, because some of the things we talk about in the concepts and a lot of people have just not heard this stuff, and they go, well, I never heard that before, or no, that can't be right. She has to have it wrong. I think people are going to be very surprised if they do their own research and find out what's out there, and what's been out there for a long time is exactly what we talk about in this episode.
Yeah. And some may be familiar with it to an extent, but it sounds hard to do what Rachel just said, sacrifice us, loving each other, so man, appreciate you, Rachel. Anywhere people could continue to find you. I know you mentioned your Substack. Anything else?
Yeah, my Substack has some great
channel.
stuff on it. That's rwilson.substack.com. You can find my book on Amazon, and you can also go to my YouTube channel. I have a little YouTube channel. It's just Rachel.Wilson, I think it is on YouTube. Or if you just search my
Rachel,
name, it
send us
comes
all
up.
those links, and we'll pin them at the top of the episode.
Okay, I will.
For the viewers, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Transfigured Life. Well, thank you again, and you guys have a good one.
Take care, everybody, and Happy New Year.
Thanks.
Thanks.